Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week we interview a film professional, and this week I'm joined by editor Chris Wyatt, whose work includes Anne Bullion, Living, and more recently, Mary and George, just to name a few. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I guess my first question is, how did you get involved with Mary and George?
I had worked with Oliver before on Living, and this happened to be the next thing that he went on to, and I was fortunate that that our paths were able to continue for that particular production, because it happened quite quickly after the end of Living. So yeah, so it was a fortunate piece of timing.
Well, it sounds like you've had a long relationship with Oliver. So, like, how did that relationship start?
Well, in fact, actually, because I was very fortunate to be introduced to him and to get to work on Living. I'd previously seen some of his earlier films, and particularly Moffat, and was just thought that was an extraordinary film. And I was just very fortunate to be able to be introduced to him because obviously he relocated from South Africa to the UK to make Living. And they were looking for UK-based editors. Uh, and I was just very lucky to actually be put in front of him, so to speak. And and we've so far, touch wood, had a very good, constructive, collaborative working relationship.
My friends and I would make little videos in our backyards, imitations of Indiana Jones and Star Wars. Eventually that need to tell stories became more of a technical interest and an interest in the art. To me, what's exciting is using cinema in its full potential, which is rhythm and sound design and music. Our job is to set up expectations and then deliver on them. I'm Brian Cates, and this is my course in film editing.
So when you're looking at new projects, like what do you look for and how do you like to choose your projects?
Actually, it varies. I mean, certainly, I think taking Oliver and Living, that was an interesting one because actually, I was very much that I was driven by wanting to work with Oliver because of his past stuff. So, interestingly, if one looks at the film Living and other things that I had done, it wouldn't necessarily be a territory that I would be, that would necessarily excite me. I mean, as it happens, it did, and I thoroughly enjoyed the process. But that was very much director based, and I think more often than not, I'd like to work with directors that I find interesting, that are maybe pushing the envelope a little bit, that are actually not quite mainstream, and just have a very interesting take on things. So I'm very much director driven and tend to trust a director's vision in terms of what they're doing in order to collaborate with them. So it comes from that rather than being either genre based. I mean, obviously the script and everything is fundamental and very important, but for me, first and foremost, it's the caliber of the director.
Well, that's interesting because you're going to spend a lot of time with the directors in the edit
Yeah,
suite, so
absolutely,
it better
absolutely.
be a good relationship.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I was going through a couple of interviews I found that you had done, and in one of them you sort of were discussing editing, and you sort of described it as a lot of editing is about the experience of life itself. That's sort of the quote I pulled from it, and I'm wondering if you
Sure.
could sort of elaborate on that.
Well, I think that, I mean, I think that possibly is something to do with, I may have used that in context of partly the personal aging process, and how I think that, I think editing, is something that matures, and I think that actually when one is editing, you're bringing in certain personal experiences and life experiences, and I think it's just that the more that one experiences through life, the more one becomes receptive to certain elements of certain elements within the constructs of a film. I mean, that's particularly true in living, I think, which is I always felt when we were making that it was very sort of demographic specific, and it was probably focused more at people who had more sand in the bottom of the hourglass than the top. And so it felt that actually having had that life experience made one more receptive to some of the themes and things that it touches on. So I just feel that there's a way in which one can marry personal life experience with part of the editing process. It's being responsive to both the emotional and the intellectual elements of what make a film or TV series. Certainly for in terms of character, responses to characters and their situations.
Well, you've been working for a long time as an editor, so how has your life and I guess like how has your life experiences changed and evolved your editing?
Well, I think it's more that the fact that, but as one goes through life, one will have a different way of approaching certain aspects. I mean, certain things that maybe when in your 20s feel like hugely massive. I don't know, let's say a breakup of a relationship, for example, but then later on, one begins to sort of look back and think, actually, I can see now why that fell apart, and I can understand how I'm more rooted in relationships that I've had later in life. So it's more about how one responds or reacts to certain things that happen in life, such as that, losing parents. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody loses parents or people that are close to them later in life. I mean, obviously that happens at different times, but I just think there are stages through one's life where you begin to have different emotional responses to things, whether it be relationships, whether it be anything that the passing of someone, etc., etc. And I think that gives you a different kind of grounding in how you can then respond to things when you see them being put on the screen visually. So I think that it makes you a sort of more rounded person, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes perfect sense. I guess one of my questions for you then is, we get into Mary and George, and you cut the pilot. And when I've talked to editors, pilots are always seen as a tougher part of the process because you're trying to find the story, find the pacing, find the structure. So I'm wondering, what were some of the challenges with Mary and George that you had to figure out?
Well, actually, that is absolutely true, and of course, obviously, the thing always about a pilot is tone, and I think that's the thing that Oliver is incredibly good at, and that's essentially where I think that's where a lot of his great skill lies, is in that idea of the tone of something, and how something's going to feel, and also the pace of it, and things like that. And I think that certainly with Mary and George, I think he was very clear about how he saw it and set it up that way. And I think that it's always very important from a pilot's point of view to actually be able to set the stall out and actually say that this is how it's going to be, or this is how it's perceived as being the entry point to the whole thing. But at the same time, I still think it's important to almost compartmentalize it. So even though you think, okay, this is the first of many, and okay, Mary and George is a limited series, but I always think it must be really hard if one is starting out on something which might have multiple seasons. Because then it's the gateway to something that's going to be quite extensive. But you might not know that when you're doing it, but of course that has that potential. But I still think that it's still about, even though there's the broad thing of the whole thing. It's still, I think, about still keeping it focused on what's actually happening with the story at that time when you're kicking it off. So even though there's a responsibility for the wider landscape, I still think it's very important to make the content of the first thing, the pilot that you're doing, still, sing as much as it can. And then hopefully that will then resonate through, later episodes.
There's a scene in the first episode, and it's and I was wondering if it started as two scenes and then were merged into one. It's sort of cross-cutting between the funeral of George's father, but with the fight between Mary and George the First. Was that originally two scenes that got sort of cut together, or was that something discovered?
Yes, in fact, there was. We did, in fact, do. Yes, I think that is very, very astute. We did, in fact, do that because it was a way in which we wanted to set. The funeral scene itself was a standalone scene, as written and as shot, but indeed we then did want to actually set, again, this was a tonal thing, we did want to actually bring in the idea of what was happening to Mary, essentially what she had actually experienced to get her to that point, because it may have seemed that she may have felt maybe slightly cold at that point, but one wanted to understand slightly more about what her character motivation was to be in that headspace at the funeral. So indeed we did actually, I think, marry two scenes together.
Well, the thing I really liked about it is, from a story standpoint, it was just a really unique way of introducing I don't know how to describe it, but that it created this nice connection between Mary and George.
Yeah.
How flexible do you find Oliver in the cutting room? Like, is he allowed, does he sort of go away and you're like, okay, I've got this idea, I'm going to play with it? Or do you have to sort of, show him some stuff? And then
it's actually a bit of both. I mean, he's incredibly good. I mean, because I always find that for me, and I think I'm not sure for most editors, but I think for me, the best time editorially is actually during the shoot when you're on your own. And that's the first that you actually have the material, and that's when you can really kind of wrestle with it. So I like to be sort of quite aggressive with the material at that stage to actually sort of test what the boundaries are a possibility. And Oliver's very good at responding to those sorts of things. So there's always a kind of safe version, and there's the more sort of, slightly wilder version maybe. And he's always very good at responding to those sorts of things. When we get into the edit, he's very much he's very much an in the room person, which is fine and great. But again, always open to experimentation or trying things that are slightly left field, whatever. So but he's a very focused person in the room. He's actually he's one of the more focused directors that I've actually worked with. I mean, some do actually can't stand kind of being in the room the whole time, and they need to just say what they think and leave. And that's equally fine, And I think that again comes from, that's something you just learn. It's just that you have to be adaptable to be able to do both, to actually have the person that can't sit with you all the time and wants to go away. But Oliver very much is a person that likes to be here pretty much all the time. So it develops. It is much more a on the coalface collaborative experience.
Probably one of the smartest things I've ever done for my career. It gave me all the tools that I needed to be able to jump into a new career.
Getting myself into a mindset, thinking like an editor, being around people that I can talk to on that level was really invaluable to me.
A lot of the things that I learned from that class, I still think about. I loved the classroom. I loved the computer stations. We built a sense of community.
And it also instills a lot of confidence in you to take that and go out into the world.
After I took the class, I felt very prepared to take the next step.
I owe Manhattan Workshop the career that I have right now. Things have been going great, and I really have the Manhattan Workshop to thank for that.
in one of the interviews I found with you, you talked about trying to edit so that you engage the audience in a particular way. And I'm wondering, when you're in the editing room, unfortunately, you're not in the process of showing it to people that are gonna be
Yeah.
the audience. So how do you figure out if you're engaging the audience?
Good question. I think that, well, for me, there's always, I suppose the thing I've always felt is that the audience is the final collaborator. So I think that there's a way in which if audiences want to actually engage with something or enjoy something, they will. So if you give them, 98% of the picture, they will give you the last 2% because if they feel engaged. And that might be just quite as simple as, ending a scene earlier than it was as written, because one usually finds that no matter how lean and how tight a script is, the minute it turns into something that's visually represented, all of a sudden all the exposition starts sort of coming out the woodwork. So it's just by trying to clean that up as much as possible, so you leave certain avenues or certain opportunities open for people to bring their own interpretation to it, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. And so and also I feel that the editor, and I've probably, this is something I've said before, so I don't want to say anything endlessly, but I think that is part of the editor's responsibility, and also it's the privilege that you are the first member of the audience. You are the first person that actually gets to sit in front of this stuff, and you get the opportunity to actually make a difference. So you actually are able to, construct and connect things. So I think that editors, there's this whole thing about editors being storytellers, but I feel that editors are much more like cartographers. It's drawing a map or re-landscaping something. It's to give people a way through. It's to show them a path to actually get both the intellectual information they need to hold the story together, but more importantly, to have the emotional responses when they're necessary. And I think that that's where, by paring back and allowing an audience in, if you like, is where you get the stronger emotional responses. And that usually is by leaving it. I tend to find it's by the things you leave out is what makes things more effective for an audience to be responsive.
It's interesting because I feel like nowadays I'm seeing a lot of shows where they're blatantly obvious, I guess you could say, or they like tell you instead of showing you.
Exactly.
And it seems like something that's just sort of started to happen in the last 10 years. Have you started to see that, or has that always been
I've
something?
seen it. It's really weird. And again, I suppose this is partly to do with the fact that I have, I suppose, been able to be doing it for quite some time. There was a period, and I think, again, if we're talking maybe, I can't remember, but I certainly felt that at the time that maybe TV were doing things like The Wire, you suddenly felt that actually this is a kind of bold new time, because this is really interesting, the way in which, on scale, and also the fact that and I just felt that this was something that was incredibly game-changing in a way, and it actually changed the approach for so many things that kind of came in its wake, that people, I think, were beginning, or film and TV makers were beginning to be slightly more open and not so much experimental, but allowing the not to be so kind of show and tell kind of thing. You say it and you see it, but you don't need to sort of say and see it. And I think we've kind of come full circle. I think we've found ourselves back now, and I certainly have felt this when I have dabbled back, which is why actually Mary and George was quite refreshing, because it felt to me as though this was again challenging or pushing at the boundaries of TV material, because I have found that certainly in British television, it has kind of gone back again to that kind of, you say it, you see it, you remind people of it again and again and again, which is a great shame, because actually, that goes back to what I was just saying. You have to trust the audience. I mean, one hopefully is making this because you want to have a positive response from a viewer. You want them to engage. And surely the best way for that is to allow them to feel as though they're somehow participating. They're not actively participating, but they feel as though they're more emotionally or intellectually engaged. And therefore it's an experience.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's why that scene sort of stuck out for me, because it felt almost like literature, like reading a novel where it's like, we're not gonna, we're not gonna sugarcoat things. We're not gonna make it easy for you. You have to keep up, and it's like, figure out
Yeah.
what's going on. Here we are, um, which is, it's just sad sort of to see that, because it gets frustrating when you're watching a show and it's like, we already saw that. Why are you
Yeah,
telling us
exactly.
about it?
Exactly. Yeah, and again, I've often used that kind of reference, that you can actually, have somebody, standing on a windswept hillside looking vacantly out to sea, or you can have somebody do the same thing and saying, "Oh, I'm feeling really sad." It's the fact that again, it's exactly as you say. If you actually visually get something, you can see clearly how somebody is feeling emotionally. You then really don't need somebody to underline it or say, "Oh, that person's looking sad." It's a real shame, I think, when there isn't the confidence to allow the confidence that actually a viewer will be able to get that response and that engagement with something.
Yeah, it's a hat on a hat.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, with TV shows, like I think about Mary and George, or George and Mary, and basically you have a number of episodes to sort of stretch out and really work the story and figure things out. Do you prefer having that sort of length of time to tell a story versus like a film, or which way do you like to work?
In fact, or actually, weirdly, both. I mean, I think that is the great thing about TV, that it does give you that huge canvas, and I think that the fact that you can actually do things over, several hours is actually is really great. And I really like both. I mean, I loved the discipline, I suppose, or the rigid nature of a film that maybe feels as though it needs to be completely done and dusted in 100 minutes or something. I really also, I love that as one kind of challenge. But then I also really do think, if you're working on shows like Mary and George, and also Top Boy that I was involved with very early on, where you've got 4, 5, 6 hours to actually expand these things and actually get into these multiple characters and follow these threads through over a longer time. I find that also very exciting, because you don't get that opportunity in film, as it were. This idea that you do have a broader, larger canvas is always more exciting. And in many ways, I think there's always I was very fortunate when I worked with Yann Demange on the first season of Top Boy, because we were able to do the whole season. And I have to say, that's something I actually really also like. I like to be able to be, because I know that it's hard because of multiple directors and schedules and et cetera. But actually, I really do like that. I love that, of actually having that overview of the whole thing. And I think with Mary and George, I think because, again, working with Oliver on his 3, which I think was just under half the amount of screen time, it always feels slightly bereft that you haven't quite been with the characters on their entire journey. So I think you obviously leave them an appropriate jumping off point, which I think we do with Oliver's episodes. But there's always a way in which you feel slightly shortchanged. You'd like to have gone the whole way. And I think that's if one is going to be involved on these large TV shows, I think it's the more that one can have an overview, which goes back to what you were saying initially about setting the stall and the pilot, etc., etc. But I still feel there's a way in which it's still nice to be able to be with those characters for, you know, a long time, if one's going to make that commitment to it. But scheduling just makes that impossible.
Now, you mentioned the discipline of something like a 100-minute film or what have you, but then it made me think about actual film and the discipline that was required to work on actual film, because you know, if you made a cut, you were splicing the actual film, and, you know, it might go to the night cutter and what have you. Do you miss anything about working on film?
I suppose only really in a kind of rose-tinted glasses kind of way. There's something about the physicality of film that I miss. There's something about being in a room surrounded by it. There's something about the fact that, and also how that actually changes one's thinking time, because the manual process actually means that there's kind of, as you're doing the practical, there's kind of something is still circulating. So there's something about that I kind of miss. And I think that now, because I'm by no means a rapid fire editor with the, you know, all bells and whistles computer-based systems, but obviously it's a different kind of approach. But I think it's important also now, with the way that editors work at this time, is to actually have times at which one is able to step away from it, and just have that chance to let things settle and bed down. And then when you come back, and that thing that was a problem, you know, 2 days ago, doesn't seem to be a problem now. I think that's important. And I think that in the days of working on film, I think that there was because the process was slightly more sedate, I think there was a way in which one had chance to think more about it. And also, well, again, because you were working in essentially a destructive format, you know, as you say, you know, you're making endless sellotape joins. You didn't want to make so many to completely rubbish your work print. So it was always kind of, oh, gradually you're out here and you're gradually doing this. Whereas now you can be much more, you know, as I was saying earlier, you can be much more aggressive now, because it's non-destructive. And it's just it's a different way of working. But as I say, but when I think back, this is, you know, put me back in a room with a, you know, Steenbeck or a Moviola and a room full of film cans, and I'd probably think, oh Christ, get me back to the Avid, you know. So, you know, it's one of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting because I miss the tactileness of it.
Yeah, exactly. No, absolutely.
I love being able to be like, I have 5 different versions of this, and I don't have to worry about it getting jammed in the projector, and, you know.
Yeah, yeah, actually.
I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
Well, I would say off the top of my head, it would be Breaking Bad, because again, I think, like The Wire, it was something that changed the landscape of TV, and it actually, and I just think that as a character study, it's incredible. I think, you know, and I revisit it often just to you know, enjoy those character developments, because it's, I think, just an amazing show.
The thing I love about shows like that is when you watch the pilot and you're like, it was so thoroughly thought out. And they had so much, and it was so well structured. You're just like, oh, they nailed it.
No, absolutely, totally.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview today.
Not at all, and thank you, and thank you for actually doing it this early in the morning as well. So I appreciate that.
No worries.
That was great.
And that's it for our show this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, or of course on Instagram at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.